before you die, you go into a period of transition. This is when you actually leave the hospice, sometimes with a deathbed visitor, and go into an area of love and light. And in this area of love and light, you meet dead relatives and also the spiritual beings who are there to meet you and welcome you. And they sort of prepare you for what's going to happen.
Hello, passionate listeners and watchers. Welcome to Passion Harvest. I am Louisa, your host. Thank you so much for joining me wherever you are in the world right now. I am so excited about my guest today. It's been one of my passions to have him on the show, Dr. Peter Fenwick. Dr. Peter Fenwick is an expert on near-death experiences and end-of-life experiences. Dr. Fenwick is a neuropsychiatrist and neuropsychologist who is known for his pioneering studies of end-of-life phenomena. He's published several books, including The Art of Dying, The Truth, The Light, and The Hidden Door. This is his story and this is his passion. Dr. Peter Fenwick, I am so honored and excited to have you on the show today. Welcome to Passion Harvest.
I'm really excited too, because I'm half Australian and I hear you're in Australia.
Yes, I am.
And so that is wonderful. In fact, I believe you're in Sydney.
Yes.
I'm not sure that's a good choice. I mean, it's a fantastic choice, opera and everything.
It's temporary.
But Melbourne is where my mother came from.
Oh, okay.
And she was the first woman surgeon to go to England and obtain her Royal College of Edinburgh higher surgery degree.
Oh,
so
wow, that's amazing.
I've had something to live up to.
Gosh, you have. Well, I've already introduced you in your introduction, but if you wouldn't mind just giving a brief, I'm sure everyone knows you, you're world famous and I think you're amazing, but just a brief background of what you do.
Yes. As I say, my mother was a surgeon, and so I wanted to be a doctor from a very early age. And as I got older, I could see where I wanted to go, and that is to understand the brain and the mind. And so my training went through Queen Square, which is a neurology hospital, and through the Maudsley Hospital, which is a psychiatric hospital. So I am a neuropsychiatrist. I'm trained in both of those. My life has been looking at things to do with the brain, the mind, and consciousness.
Wonderful, and how you scientifically work the two together or whether they're separate. I guess my first question is, what happens when we die from all your amazing research? And it's a big question. That could just be one episode, but what happens when we die?
Well, let's look at that. First of all, it depends if I'm looking at it from the point of view of our reductionist science, or if I'm using now quantum mechanical science, because they both give totally different answers. Mm-hmm. So let's look at it from the reductionist science point of view. Well, as you come up to death, you go through a whole set of stages. First one is premonitions. In other words, you may get some inkling that it's going to happen. And I have a number of people who have told me their stories. One was a lady who woke up in the middle of the night, terrified, absolutely terrified, because her daughter, she knew, was going to die. And she looked around and her daughter, in fact, was in bed with her. And so she said, well, it must have just been a dream. But sadly, it wasn't, because 2 days later, a car came and unfortunately killed her. And she reports that she had exactly the same feelings that she had in the dream. So that's one. There was, in England, there used to be a cold tip in a village called Aberfan. And this tip one day slithered down over a primary school, killing most of the children. And I really feel sorry for this mother, because her daughter 2 or 3 days before had come to her and said, "Don't worry about me, Mum. When I die, I'll be with my friends." And she said, "Oh, don't be silly." No, nothing like that will happen. And then on the day that it occurred, she said to her, "I don't want to go to school today because something horrid may happen." And the mother said, "No, come on, dear. You know you have to go to school." She went, and of course she is killed. So those are two premonitions of forthcoming death. They aren't always as short as that. I have one from somebody who, his wife, I got it from his wife actually. She said that one day he came down and said, "I got to put my affairs in order." So he did. And then about 6 months later, when everything had all been sorted out, his company sent him on a trip to overseas. The plane crashed. It was a little plane. And he unfortunately was killed. But he seemed to know he was going to. And if you ask the Dalai Lama will tell you that we all know when we're going to die, and we get about a 2-year warning. And if you ask him how we know, he says, because there's a change in your breathing, a change in your thinking, and so on. Well, these are obviously subtle things that yogic masters know. I don't think most of us do, because I certainly won't be able to do that myself. I think to see a subtle change in breathing 2 years before I die. At any rate, yes, you can. And that raises the question, is time linear or is it not? So that's one of the questions which we'll just leave on the table for the moment. Then after the premonitions, we come to the actual dying process itself. So you've been given the news, you're going to die, and a reservation's been made in the hospice for you. So what do? You find out about it. You learn about the dying process. When I started this in about 2000, 2002, there wasn't very much known, but now there's loads known. And so what you can do is you look it up and see exactly what's going to happen. And there's something called deathbed anxiety. And deathbed anxiety occurs to all those who can't let go. So what's this letting go? Letting go means that everything that you have been attached to, you have to let go. Look, you're not going to take your friends in Australia with you, are you?
No.
So you have to let go of those relationships, and your friends in France for that matter too.
Yeah.
They all have to go. And there is a period when you have to do this cleaning. I think looking at it as cleaning is a very good way. And there is a palliative care theologian in Switzerland called Monica Renz, R-E-N-Z. And those of you who are interested in death and dying would do well to get her books. She's written 3 or 4 books on dying. And she talks about transition, pre-transition, transition, and post-transition. And cleaning occurs in pre-transition. This is, can be 4 or 5 days before you actually die. And you have to give everything up. And if you don't give it up, you get anxious. Mm-hmm. If you get anxious, you get very anxious. And if you get anxious, what will your doctor do? He'll zap you with midazolam, and you will miss all the dying process because you will be sort of unconscious. So get your cleaning right. Now, this is helped with in approximately the last 2 weeks before you die, when you see deathbed visitors. And they're fantastic. They come and they say hi to you. And who are they? Family members, your mother, friends who you have a very good relationship with, all of them may come along and sit at your bedside. Sometimes they sit on your bed. Why on your bed? Because it's very comforting. I mean, it's wonderful.
These are the loved ones that have already transitioned.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes. Your dead mum, your dead sister, that sort of thing. And they will also often give you a time. And as your mum gets up and goes, she says, well, I'll be back in 3 days, and we go on the journey together. And so you can actually say, Mum, don't come back then, because my son is coming from Australia and it'll take him a little while to get here. And so she can say yes, but you can't negotiate a party in the hospice. Don't come back because there's a hospice party on Friday after 10. No, she won't do that, but she will in fact put it off for something which you feel is very important to you. Now, so you get the deathbed visitors. Common, yes, 90%. And for those of your listeners who want to see pictures of a woman talking about her deathbed visitors, there's a very good one on a YouTube channel called Buffalo. It comes from Buffalo. And so if you put death and buffalo, I'm sure you'll get it. Yes, you might find lots of death of buffaloes, of course, but at any rate, you will eventually find it. It's a nice one, which is being put up there. So you go now into a phase, this is in the last week, before you die, and you go into a period of transition. It's slightly different from the transition I was talking about before. This is when you actually leave the hospice, sometimes with a deathbed visitor, and go into an area of love and light. This is how people describe it. So, and in this area of love and light, you meet again a deathbed, dead relatives, and also the spiritual beings who are there to meet you and welcome you. And they sort of prepare you for what's going to happen. So love and light is the key feature of going into that transition. Then you come back again into the hospice, and you may make this journey 2 or 3 times before you actually die. And then we're coming up quite close to death now. So I'm going to do this 2 ways. I'm going to do it through Monica Rentz's transitions. Do you remember we were talking about pre-transition when you got to clean and clean and clean and clean and clean and drop it all, because it's terribly important. And then you come in about the day before you actually die, or maybe 48 hours, something like that. You're in the transition stage. And this is the point at which your egoic structures within your brain start to collapse. And it's really interesting. It's not terribly pleasant, because none of us are used to our egoic structures collapsing, because that's our sense of I.
Right.
And in fact, what's happening is we become non-dual. Non-duality is a state of consciousness which we're beginning to understand more about. But you start to fuse with the universe. You and the universe become one. And so it's love and light and the fusing of you with the universe, and that's in post-transition. And from there, most people die. And we've had Monica Rentz over to the UK, and we've talked to her about this. Because surely just before death like that, within a day, people aren't able to give a good account. And that's not the point. The point is that they can answer with verbal sounds, not necessarily words, and gestures. And if you ask them are you happy? They go, yes. It's a very nice state to be in. And from that, then, of course, you actually die. And what attitude should you have? You have an attitude of sinking in. Sinking in is very important. You actually sink into the death process. And then you will, in fact, make your transition. And something very interesting happens then to a number of people. And that is usually if you have somebody you want to go to and leave a message with. And these are called deathbed coincidences, because they're coincident with the time that you're actually dying. And in the study we did of this, they were all within half an hour, and about 90% were linked at the time of death. So what you do, nice story. Here's one from, well, I'm choosing Australian stories, aren't I?
We're on the roll, on the theme.
And this one is a lady who's in Australia. She's sleeping very happily. And you know what happens when you sleep in Australia. You're live and alert in the UK. And in her dream, her son came to her, dripping wet. And as he came to her, and you quite often see this, his form changed. And he became, there's white light surrounded him. As soon as I say white light, you automatically say, and the feeling of love, because they go very closely together. And as he came closer and closer to her, he said, don't you worry, Mum, I'm okay. And this is one of the things about the deathbed coincidence. They give a message and that's it. And she knew that he'd died, but she obviously, she couldn't ring at that point. So she waited till she could get in touch with him. And you remember he was dripping wet. Well, in fact, his death was by drowning because he came off his boat at that time. So that's a fairly well attested deathbed coincidences. And what people who just accept reductionist science only say, well, of course, there are thousands of people dying every day. And sometime you're going to have a lucky dream. No, it's not like that. You know perfectly well what it is, and you don't report a deathbed coincidence unless you actually have one, because they are very, very meaningful. And then we come to the actual room in which people are dying. And that's interesting because a whole lot of phenomena occurred. And the medical profession was rather slow to get onto these in a formal way. And I used to, with my co-workers, go into a hospice and ask the doctor if we could look for deathbed visions and get details of what happens when people die, because it was a carer study. And they said, no, of course you can come, Peter, but you won't find anything here because they don't have them. But of course they do. And then at the end, we'd go back and we'd give a lecture on what we actually found. So it's an exposure of that sort, which has changed the way people think about it. So what you get light in the room, has a very particular quality. It is quite often associated with love and light, love and the light. And not every member of a family will see it. So what does that tell us? It's a spiritual thing. It's at a different level from a light which could be picked up by a camera, for example. Then you get things like animals howling, dogs at home that howl, birds that come into the room may drop a feather, or a lot of birds are quite often reported by hospice staff outside the room of somebody who's actually dying. So there seems to be some sort of link there. And then people in the room see shapes leaving the body. And then those are probably the main thing. And then there's another phenomenon which isn't discussed much, which is very important. Look, your mum dies, okay? She's in a hospice. And you heard this talk on Passion
Harvest.
TV already.
Passion Harvest.
Yes. And so you can feel when the body is empty. It's a very distinct feeling. One moment you look at a person who's dying, the relative who's dying, and she is dead. And then maybe half an hour later, the body is empty. It's just a casket. And hospices recognize this, but hospitals don't. And so they'll bundle your mother off to the morgue rather than just the casket, which is her dead body. So it's quite interesting. And so it requires more patience on the part of hospitals to not put the bodies in the morgue so quickly. So that's a sort of short summary of what's going to happen when we die.
Absolutely fascinating. And in your opinion, from all your research, once the spirit, the soul, the consciousness actually separates from the physical body, what do you feel happens then?
Oh, now that is such an interesting question. It seems that there is a coherent story which is emerging, and that is that the brain is not seen as the primary generator of consciousness. And this is where I think I said earlier that we have to look at two sciences. Mm-hmm. The first one is reductionist science. That means everything, little bits of material which flop about in the universe, quarks, photons, and they get into masses like cars and television sets and Zoom cameras, that sort of thing. But that's all there is. And so where does consciousness come from? Well, we don't know, but we think it's made in the brain. End of story. And this produces the most difficult problems for our neuroscience when trying to explain consciousness. You can't really. So I think in the last 40 years since quantum mechanics came in, but more recently, people have recognized there are a whole lot of phenomena which won't fit into that. And one of them is entanglement. And entanglement is if you have one particle and it is born with its brother, if you like, and you take one of the particles miles away very, very quickly, and you can look at them both and communicate. The observation of one particle determines what will happen when you see the other particle. And there's an experiment by a scientist called the Aspect experiments. And they have proved that this is so. And so the argument is then that no longer are we restricted to the brain for consciousness. The idea now is that consciousness is universal. It's everywhere. And so now we can come back and start answering your question, what happens when we die? Because until you got that straight, you'll say, well, it's the end, brain's gone, no experience. Well, it's not like that. Because there's very good evidence that the brain, in fact, acts as a filter. What you mean? Well, what I'm saying, really. Well, what's it filtering? It's filtering reality. And there is a wonderful essay on that in the Bigelow essays by Kastrup, pointing out that we actually never see the world. We see what
Bernardo Castro.
Yes.
He's been
Have you
on the
had
show.
him?
Yeah, he's great.
Oh,
He's
great.
amazing.
He's a lovely guy,
Lovely.
and he's got it absolutely right. And his essay is clarity in itself, because what he's arguing is that the brain acts as a filter. And so when you die, your consciousness, which is manifesting itself through the brain filter, in fact, comes to join universal consciousness. And so you never die, although your brain and body do die. So this really, and I think Bigelow has done a lot to help this, you have to first of all show that reductionist science has major problems to it, and that an all-inclusive science, which includes quantum mechanics, is different, because you then have a bed for consciousness, if you like, an explanation of consciousness. And so we're all conscious. We are all consciousness, and we never die. That's what the current view is. And fortunately, I have about 25 detailed essays to support that view. So it's not just one lone wolf talking about it. It's formally deduced in these essays.
Well, thank you for explaining that in simple terms. I just want to touch on something you said briefly about reality, and the brain filters our reality. Well, this could be another whole interview, but what is reality? What we perceive, is it real?
No. Okay, let's do this. The way that I like best, again, is Kastrup's article. So anybody who's listening to this podcast, Bigelow Prizes, Kastrup, read it. And to shorten and simplify what he says, because his model is good, is if you're a pilot in a storm and you look out of the window of your plane, you see a storm. But in actual fact, because I used to pilot aircraft, private aircraft, and do some flying, I know you don't look out of the window. What you look at is aspects of the storm which are important to you. So you look at your dashboard, you look at your altimeter and see if you are climbing or descending. You make sure your speed's all right, and all that sort of thing. So you never look at the storm, and there is no way I can tell what's going on in the storm except by the dashboard, by the instruments that I have. And this is true of life. So there's no way of knowing what is going on outside ourselves. We just know what our senses tell us, whether it's hot or cold, for example. Whether it is pressing against us and causing pain, all that sort of thing. And this is constructed by the brain. So it's a model. We don't see reality. We don't see the storm. We just see what our senses tell us. And it's created for us by the brain. And so where are we in this? Well, the argument is that the brain filters absolute reality. And absolute reality is a transcendent reality of which we have very good descriptions from many different people. And essentially love, light, and very, very expansive. And people who've had these deep experiences will tell you that it is absolutely amazing for them, and they're all marked by it in quite an important way. And that seems to be what the background of reality is when the filters get diminished to some extent. So think of yourself as paddling in a pool of consciousness all day. and that you
Try not to
see
get
that,
caught up in the reality. I just love
yeah,
your analogy, by the way, of the pilot. It's
yes,
fantastic.
that came from Kastrup, and I think it's such a good one. Really is.
It's
Absolutely excellent.
fantastic. I'd just like to briefly, I know you've done incredible research on near-death experience, which has certainly changed people's perception of reality. Would you mind talking a little bit about some of the research you've done on near-death experiences?
Yes. In fact, nature gives you things. And one of the things that I was given was the possibility of taking part in a BBC documentary. It's called Glimpses of Death. And it was 1988. And it was the first full-length documentary on near-death experiences in the UK. And after it, we got 2,000 letters. Do you remember letters?
Yeah.
These things you
Yes,
open and
yes,
read.
vaguely.
So we got 2,000 of those from people in the UK that had near-death experiences. And there were a lot of accounts there of what a near-death experience was like. And so I took 500 of those and sent out a questionnaire to them, and to try and define exactly what goes on in a near-death experience. And that went very well. In fact, we then wrote a book on that called The Truth in the Light. Everything at that time to do with near-death experiences had to have the word light in it. It was chosen by our publisher. So it's The Truth in the Light. And that was, I think, on the first 350 accounts that we had. So we had a large sample, and it was really a very comprehensive sample. But of course, it was a British sample. And so we have to ask the question, which others asked later, is there in fact a cultural bias? And the answer is yes and no. The main parts of the experience aren't culturally determined, like leaving your body and watching the resuscitation process. And if you are a reductionist, you're going to be in dead trouble, because you will find that if you look at the actual data on this, when they leave their body, their EEG has gone flat and their heart has stopped. So the reductionists say, oh, well, there's a little bit of brain that we couldn't see working. Rubbish. It doesn't work like that. And they're not working. They got the wrong model. And then the experiencer goes down a tunnel. The tunnel is interesting because some people just float through a void. And that can be very frightening, and a lot of negative experience of floating through the void. And then you come to a light, and you go into the light, and there you're held in perfect love. And you then may have 12% of our people had life reviews. Life reviews are interesting because it looks as if somebody has got a recording machine on throughout your life. And they show you exactly what happened. But of course, it's different because you see the effects of what you did. Like if you were in a fight and hit somebody, you feel their pain where the blow lands. If you are telling somebody off and not being kind and considerate, and they are hurt by it, you'll feel their pain in the life review. And so that can go on. Time in the near-death experience is either extended or accelerated. It's a whole life can pass by in front of your eyes very quickly. And then after that, a lot of people will go back and wander around in the near-death reality, which in our culture is rather like an English country garden. And
Like
then
something behind you. Your view is amazing.
Absolutely.
Scotland. Yeah.
Absolutely. You walk around in that with lots of lovely birds and flowers very brightly colored and so on. And then you come to a border in what's behind me. The border would probably be the law. And you know that if you go further, you will in fact die. You'll never be able to come back. And so there's usually a discussion with the person who, one of the powers that are there, and they let you know that if you go on, and some people have choice, some people don't. I think it's 30%, no, 70% who are sent back, and the others decide to come back. And they come back for the stupidest of reasons. One of our people had just done a load of washing.
Oh my gosh.
And she said, I've got to come back and iron it. I can't leave now. Well, I'm sure it was very important to her. Anyway, she produced this as a reason, and that was reckoned to be a good reason.
She hadn't had time to do the cleaning process as you spoke about earlier on.
Oh, absolutely not. She's still attached to it. And so, yeah, go on.
No, sorry, please go on.
And so then there is no return journey, and you're back in your body. And remember that there are two ways of looking at near-death experience. The reductionist model, it's all in the brain, and the quantum mechanical model, which suggests that in fact consciousness is primary, not little bits of matter floating about. And so all this is occurring in consciousness. And that's a much better theory.
Absolutely agree. I just have to briefly ask you, and I get this question asked a lot, why do some people have negative near-death experiences, in your opinion?
There are 2 or 3 types of near-death experience. There is one where what is going on is misinterpreted as being fearful. I was talking about the void and traveling through the void. This is a very common one. Another one is that, in fact, what they're describing is an intensive care psychosis. I'll give you an example of that. Person who was having a near-death experience in which he could feel the flames of hell burning him. And he could, in fact, see devils with pitchforks, which they kept putting into him. And it was very unpleasant for him. And as he came out of his psychotic state, he recognized that the flames of hell were the heating blanket that he was lying on in intensive care. And the devils were, of course, nurses with syringes injecting him. And so that's the second type. And then there are some that are truly negative. Why? They're a very small minority. I don't know, it's just the way it is for them. Don't have a good explanation.
Well, thank you for that. I guess the question, in your opinion, again, why are we here? Why are we here in our consciousness, in our human form? What is our purpose? Big question.
Wide question, isn't it? Well, you're going to get several streams of suggestions. I mean, the religious streams. We come here and have to improve ourselves in what we do, and to learn to become loving and kind with people, and not shoot them and all that sort of thing. So that is one stream. That actually is quite a broad one, because it's picked up in different cultures. And it's picked up in Revelations too. I think that you come on to fringes of experience now. And these are people who have very wide experience, and the the argument usually runs like this, that we come into this world to learn. So that's really what I've been talking about before. And the process of learning will go on through many different lives. So you'll come back again if you haven't learned it properly, and go through it again. And this then comes into the question of, why do we have this life? For example, why am I in Scotland? I'm not actually, but why does it look as if I'm in Scotland?
Okay.
And you were in Melbourne.
Sydney.
And the answer, Sydney.
Yes.
Oh gosh, yes.
Melbourne's your favorite. You told me that.
Of course, of course. And Sydney, of course, has got the Opera House and the bridge.
Yeah.
And that's because you've chosen it. And there is an argument that you choose the major things in your life, and then you come down and learn through what you feel you have to learn. But that then is a whole area where you just get accounts from people, and whether it's actually like that or not, I don't know. But one argument is that you're too limited if you think that consciousness is just human consciousness, because clearly it isn't. I mean, animals are conscious. And if you look at the majesty of some of the way insects behave, it's quite clear that they are conscious too and have a consciousness of their own. So you have to think of consciousness as being very widely distributed. Now, why do we just put ourselves in the form of human consciousness? If you look at some of the esoteric texts, some people, in fact, get information about what it's all about, and what they learn is that we come here to improve ourselves, but the heavenly bodies themselves have consciousness. The sun, you could argue, is highly conscious because it's keeping the whole thing going. Okay, I mean, we look at a little bit of it, which is just sun's rays and light and so on. But in fact, the argument from this point of view is that the sun is highly conscious and is running the whole show of the planets and so on. Then you get galaxies being conscious, and then you get super minds in the universe. So you just have to just roll with amazing data. Whether it's true or not, one doesn't know, but it makes a much more coherent story than just little bits of matter flying about.
Yes, great answer. I'm just thinking, I'm so excited to have you on the show. I'm so passionate about having you on the show. I won't keep you too much longer. Just, I guess, probably on a final question. How can we take a more holistic approach to death and dying? I find in our culture, in our world, people are so afraid of death.
Yes, and there is a whole area there which is called existential fear of death. An existential fear of death is a real phenomenon, and it's been researched now by a number of groups. If I look your listeners or viewers in the eye and say, you are going to die, I've now changed the whole of their view. We don't, in fact, usually go to a party and say, hi, where are you going to be buried? What's going to happen? We don't do that. We're terrified of death in our Western countries and don't see it as part of the natural process at all. And see what's been going on in COVID. We bond with like groups. They tend to be much more afraid of death. And that's certainly true. from COVID, and there are a number of other characteristics which those with existential fear of death have. So what we need to do is understand this, because remember, as we come up to actual death, we carry with it our existential fear of death. So when you go into the hospice, you need to learn what we've been talking about. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with this. You're just going to move on. And if you say, and I've got some lovely accounts of people who say, well, it's all rubbish. It's all, the body dies and that's me gone. Thanks, bye. And when they're actually dying, it's not like that. They say, I want to see what's happening next. Come on, let's get on with it, and so on. And there's nobody saying, I'm going to be ruled out, because they all have this feeling that the process is a process. They're in the process and it's going to continue. So it's interesting.
Fascinating. Can I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
That's it. How can we live our best life?
How can we lead our best life?
Live our best life.
Oh, that's a very easy and a very simple one. Be kind.
Oh,
That's all you have to do. Just be kind.
that's lovely.
And that ticks all the boxes.
Beautiful. I'm just wondering, on a final note, is there anything you'd like to share with the Passion Harvest audience that I haven't asked you?
No, I think we've gone through death pretty extensively. I think probably what I'll say is just tell you the story of, I was giving a talk at a conference, and one of the hospices nurses came up to me. And remember, I'm talking Canada, I'm talking about remoteness, and I'm talking about families not visiting the dying. And so she said to me, nobody dies alone in my hospice. And I just couldn't believe that, because they are so remote. So I said, why is that? And she said, well, when they're coming up to death, and you remember that deathbed visitors come in the last fortnight, she would say, who do you think is going to come and pick you up? And so they would give, somebody, whoever it is. And she'd say, fine. And then the next morning she'll say, has Mary been yet? And they would say no. And then one morning they would say, yes, she came yesterday. And then she says, well, next time she comes, you go with her. Oh. And so, in fact, their actual parting is with somebody who they know and love.
Dr. Peter Fenwick, it has been an absolute honor to have you on Passion Harvest, and I just want to thank you again so much.
And I would like to thank you very much at being half Australian to be able to come and visit you in Sydney. It's a real pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. If you liked this episode, please do subscribe for weekly passionate, inspirational interviews.